Hi, the title of today's lecture is Human Variation. It's very interesting because humans are one of the most morphologically variable species of living animals. And despite how morphologically variable we are, the genetic basis of that variation is exceptionally small. According to researchers involved in the Human Genome Project, there are only about 30,000 human genes. And similarly, biochemical evidence shows that humans and chimpanzees differ by as little as 1 to 2%, and that those differences accumulated over 5 to 6 million years. Given these facts, the questions that we need to ask are, why do modern humans appear to vary so much from one another, and what are the factors responsible for that inherited variation? The first step in understanding human variation is characterizing the variation. When different groups of people came into contact with another, they try to explain that the variation that they see. When you encounter someone that looks different than you, you try and understand how they look different and why they look different. Skin color is one of the most frequently explained traits. Most systems of classification of human variation were based on it. One of the earliest examples of a system of classification of human variation came from 1350 BC in Egypt. The Egyptians identified 4 different skin colors. The first were red for the Egyptians, yellow for the Easterners, white for the Northerners, and black for the Southerners. In the 16th century, it was marked by a period of intense exploration and colonization. Europe began colonizing both the New and the Old World, and this contact between peoples from the New and the Old World led to an increasing awareness of human variation. For example, Jean Bodin in 1530 through 1596, he noted that there were many differences in human groups. The people of the South, he wrote, are of a contrary humor and disposition compared to them of the North. These are great and strong, they are little and weak. They of the North hot and moist, the others cold and dry. The one hath a big voice and green eyes, the other hath a weak voice and black eyes. So he really noted, this is over 500 years ago, and he noted people varied, people were different. His characteristics of human groups were purely descriptive, and they relied exclusively on outward appearance and the Hippocratic concept of humors. The early classifications used terms such as varieties, types, species, and nations, and none of these characteristics for these classifications really used biological features. Most attempted to provide explanations for those observed differences. For example, Francois Bernier in 1684, he noted that there are 4 or 5 species or races of men in particular whose difference is so remarkable that it may be properly used of as the foundation for a new division of the earth. So there are 4 different races that he listed: the Europeans, the Africans, the Asians, and the Lapps. Following Bernier, humans were viewed by many scholars as natural beings who could be described in a similar fashion to dogs or apes. This viewpoint was very controversial given the religious influences of the time, which God had created man in his own image. For many scholars, human diversity was considered part of the great chain of being, that where all living creatures occupied a position on a continuous scale from the lowest to the highest and most perfect. This is an Aristotelian concept popular in pre-Enlightenment scientific thought. And you can see a figure of the great chain of being in the evolution PowerPoint. Many writers from this time period also grappled with basic questions of whether human races were separate species or varieties of the same species. This latter question had implications for the spiritual unity of humans and their descent from Adam and Eve. Polygenicists believed that human races were were actually describing separate biological species, and each of those biological species had descended from different atoms. This doctrine had its origin in the United States and had proponents such as Louis Agassiz and Samuel George Morton. The first scientific attempt to categorize the newly discovered variation among humans was by Linnaeus. Linnaeus created a taxonomic classification which put humans into 4 groupings, and he put them as subspecies. And he put them as subspecies based on their geography, their skin color, their humors, their posture, and their customs. The 4 different subspecies were Homo sapiens europus, Homo sapiens afer, Homo sapiens asiaticus, and Homo sapiens americanus. So back in 1735, nearly 300 years ago, Linnaeus considered modern humans all one species with lots of variation. Interestingly, he also included in his classification what he called wild men, Homo sapiens ferus, and 6 varieties of Homo sapiens monstrus. Interesting, just a couple notes on Linnaean taxonomy. We always italicize the names because they're in a foreign language, Latin, and the genus is capitalized, but species and subspecies are not. Sapiens is not capitalized, afer is not capitalized. This is because the genus names are nouns and the species and subspecies are adjectives. Historically, Linnaeus was initially classified humans with other primates, and in his later editions, he removed them to their own order based on discussions with other colleagues. Linnaeus, at this point, assigned each human subspecies behavioral and intellectual qualities. He gave the least complimentary descriptions to the African blacks, and this ranking was typical of the period, and it reflected the European view that Europeans were superior to all other peoples. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach in 1781 is often referred to as the father of physical anthropology, as well as the founder of racial classifications. He classified humans into 5 different races, and these are terms that you've probably seen and or heard today: Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Malay, Ethiopian, American. They're often referred to as white, yellow, brown, black, and red. He is best known for having coined the term Caucasian, which is derived from the mountain range between Russia and Georgia. Now, Blumenbach believed that Homo sapiens had been created in the Caucasus Mountains and then spread, and he believed that climate, environment, modes of life, and transmission of acquired characteristics then shape people into different races. He believed that racial variation was superficial and could be changed by changing the environment and changing behavior. His work was criticized, though, because skin color is not a discrete category. It's not a discrete variable. It shows overlapping expression between groups and thus is not a very good method of categorization. So scientists from this time period argued that we should be using characteristics that do not overlap between groups, that are uniformly expressed within groups, that is, they have minimal within group variation, that is, all the shades of white should be all one shade of white. All black is exactly the same shade of black. And these characteristics should all be stable, that they're not influenced by environmental factors. We all know that skin color is capable of changing when you go out in the sun. It can get darker. So the scientists from this time period who were criticizing Blumenbach's work suggested that we use non-adaptive traits. So traits that don't overlap between groups, that are uniformly expressed within groups, and that are stable, non-adaptive traits. Spoiler alert, they never found such a trait, but they argued that this is what we should be looking for. Anders Retzius in 1942 is a Swedish anatomist who developed what's known as the cephalic index. And this was a method of describing the shape of the head. The cephalic index is derived by dividing maximum head breadth by maximum head length. Because people could be neatly categorized by a single number, this provided an extremely efficient method for describing and ordering phenotypic variation. Individuals that had an index of less than 75 were referred to as having long, narrow heads, and they were referred to as dolichocephalic. Individuals whose cephalic index was between 75 and 80 were referred to as mesiocephalic, middle-headed, and those greater than 80 were brachycephalic, short-headed. Now, this was thought to be wonderful because it categorized people by a single number. Northern Europeans were dolichocephalic, Southern Europeans were brachycephalic, and this led to numerous national debates over which group was superior. Were the Northerners or the Southerners superior? Several African populations were then explored in terms of their head shape, and they were found to be dolichocephalic. And all of a sudden, people realized that the cephalic index was not a reliable racial indicator. Landsteiner, in 1900, discovered the ABO blood group, and Ludwig Hirschfeld in 1910 in Poland was the one that suggested that blood groups could actually be used to delineate biochemical races. And they created a biochemical race index consisting of the ratio to A to B blood in a population. And they identified three major racial types: the Europeans, the Intermediates, and the Asia-Africans, based on the proportion of A blood or B blood in the population. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, racial classifications continued to be generated. A few biologists, however, such as Ashley Montagu and Julian Huxley, began to argue that it is difficult to use zoological nomenclature for human classification because of language, because of religion, that they introduce complications that are not seen in the animal world. They argued that the race concept is unproductive for the study of human variation. Montagu was probably the most vocal opponent of the use of the term race to classify and study human variation. So Ashley Montagu was the most vocal opponent of the race concept. He's from 1936, and he was the first person to argue for the use of an ethnic group as the replacement for the term race, because race has too much non-biological and stereotypic baggage. He defined an ethnic group as a number of populations comprising the single species which individually maintain their differences, both physical and cultural differences, by means of isolating mechanisms such as geographic or social barriers. Now, Montagu did not deny that there were differences between populations, but he noted that there were no clear boundaries in human variation. He argued that the goal should not be to classify, but to discover what factors produce and change in gene frequencies. Human beings, he wrote, are the only creatures who are able to behave irrationally in the name of reason. As early as 1944, Dobzhansky, a population geneticist, provided one of the first genetic definitions of races. He defined races as populations differing in the incidence of certain genes, but actually exchanging or potentially able to exchange genes across whatever boundaries separate them. There were two books produced during this time. One was by Kuhn, Carn, and Birdswell in 1950. And in this book, they used morphological data to explore human variation, and they identified 30 different races. Boyd in 1950 used blood groups and identified 6 races, and Kuhn in 1962 published a book on the origin of races, in which he only identified 5 living races, and he claimed they all could be traced to Homo erectus throughout the world. It was in response to Carlton Kuhn's book in 1962 that Frank Livingstone published an article on the non-existence of human races. Livingstone pointed out that the static nature of race is not compatible with the dynamic notion of natural selection. Livingstone, of course, did not deny that there were differences between populations, but rather he suggested that as an alternative to this static racial approach, we should be focusing on geographical variation of traits, in particular clinal variation. He argued that there are no races, there are only clines. In 1994, In 1994, The Bell Curve was a book that was produced by Murray and Herrnstein. And these two gentlemen argue that the intelligence of individuals was inherited and unchangeable throughout their lifetime. So you inherit your intelligence from your parents, and you can't change your inheritance. And they argued that individual success was based on your intelligence. That in particular, to some of the very controversial comments that they made were that African Americans have lower average scores than European Americans, and they concluded that African Americans were likely to remain at the bottom of society. There are a number of logical failures in Murray and Herrnstein's bell curve. First of all, they do not distinguish between the measurement tool, such as an IQ test, and the thing which is being measured, intelligence. They also ignored a number of confounding variables, such as education, social status, cultural difference, and they presented a spurious relationship as cause and effect. Correlation is not causation. Plus, their results have never been confirmed by independent sources. For example, Mensa, the High IQ Society, they say that the high IQ proportions are the same for African and European Americans. You might expect that if Murray and Herrnstein were correct, that we would have fewer really smart Africans compared to European Americans, but that's not the case. Henry Grubb also notes that the number of individuals that are African American that have low IQ is equivalent to the number of European Americans that have low IQ. So we see that this is a graph showing the nature of IQ scores, and this is the low IQ, this is high IQ, and this is the mean. The average score is 100. 50% of the scores fall between 90 and 110, which is considered normal intelligence. 25% of scores are above 140, which is the threshold for genius, and 5% of scores are below 70, the threshold for mental disability. If one group had a higher IQ than another, their entire curve would have to be higher than that of the other group. So you would expect the whole distribution to be moved over to the right. If the pinks had a higher IQ than the blues, we would expect pinks to have a higher average right here, so it'd be like 110, and a higher proportion of geniuses than the blues, and the blues to have a higher proportion of mental disabilities. About 2.5% of pinks should be geniuses. And analysis of the data does not show this to be true. Similarly, if blacks really had lower IQ than whites, we would expect to see whites overrepresented at high IQ levels and blacks overrepresented at low IQ levels. According to Mensa and Henry Grubb studies, this is not the case. Both blacks and whites are proportionally represented throughout the IQ scale, regardless of whether the IQ is a good measure of intelligence or not. Now, there are a lot of reasons that people do poorly on the test. Some people have test anxiety. There is also the way the test is administered. There's lack of familiarity with the objects being referred to. And it's very important to recognize that standardized tests do not represent all types of intelligence. African and European Americans perform equally well on untimed tests, and European Americans do better on the time test. Lieblich and Kugelmaß found that children from societies which value speed, such as Jewish children, do better on tests than those from societies that abhor speed, such as Arab society. There's an old Arab saying that time is of the devil. Speed is not valued in some societies. IQ is also not solely inherited, but also reflects environment as well. Black children that were adopted by well-off white families have above average IQ scores, similar to white children from the same socioeconomic class. Thus, the 15-point difference between U.S. African and U.S. white populations is more likely to due to differences in environment as well as test biases than to differences in intelligence. The biggest problem with the bell curve is that it attempts to use differences in IQ score to make judgments about the capability of different groups. Today, physical anthropologists view human variation as the result of evolutionary factors such as genetic drift, founder effect, gene flow, and adaptation of the past and the present to environmental conditions. Although cultural adaptation has certainly played a role in the evolution of Homo sapiens, in this lecture I'm primarily going to be focusing on biological factors affecting human variation. There are two major types of physiological responses to environmental conditions. The first are long-term evolutionary or genetic changes, that is, all individuals within that affect all individuals within a population or a species, as well as short-term functional responses known as acclimatization. And these generally occur within an individual's lifetime, and they affect both populations and individuals. Long-term physiological adaptations include things like skin color, which varies with species. These are adaptations to balance solar radiation and vitamin D production. I'm going to be talking about this in more detail. We also have lactase tolerance, which also varies within species. It allows herding peoples to process milk into their adulthood. We have body hair loss, which is species-wide and helps maintain homeostasis in hot climates. And we also have reproductive adaptation to high altitude, which varies within species and results in birth weights similar to low-altitude populations. All right. Skin color is often probably the most cited example of long-term adaptation and natural selection in human populations. It follows a geographical pattern, especially before 1500 AD when people really started moving around. One of the things they found is that populations with the darkest skin colors are found in the tropics, closer to the equator, while populations with the lightest skin colors are found in more temperate environments. And this reflects Glager's rule. Birds and mammals living in warmer climates have more melanin and therefore darker skin, fur, or feathers than do populations of the same species living in cooler climates. So, birds in the north, birds in the south. Sorry, bears. I'm brain dead, I suppose. Okay. Well, skin color is predominantly influenced by three main substances: hemoglobin, keratin, and melanin. For the purposes of this class, we're not really going to be talking about hemoglobin or keratin. We're going to primarily restrict our discussion to melanin and how melanin influences skin color. Melanin is a granular substance that is produced by melanocytes, which are specialized cells in your epidermis, which is the outermost layer of your skin. And the epidermis and the melanocytes have the capacity to absorb ultraviolet rays. All humans have the same number of melanocytes. The amount and size of the melanin granules vary. Skin color is a spectrum. It's often difficult to fit individuals neatly into categories by skin color. Reflected spectrophotometry is used to quantify differences in skin color between individuals. Studies have also shown that skin color varies within as well as between populations. It's affected by both sex and age. Males are generally 3 to 4% darker than females, and females generally need more vitamin D during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And the question is, what events have taken place in the evolution of our species to lead to the dramatic differences in skin color across the world? There have been several models that have been proposed to explain the evolution of dark skin near the equator and light skin further from the equator. In particular, ultraviolet radiation can cause severe damage to unprotected skin. The most immediate effect is sunburn and skin cancer. Melanin provides protection from overexposure to sunlight radiation, which can cause genetic mutations in skin cells. These mutations cause skin cancer, which can eventually result in death. Natural selection favors darker skin in areas near the equator, where exposure to ultraviolet rays is most intense. Exposure to sunlight triggers a protective mechanism in our skin called increased melanin production, and this occurs in all humans except albinos and some northern Europeans where tanning is very removed. In considering the potentially harmful effects of ultraviolet radiation from an evolutionary perspective, 3 points must be kept in mind. The first is that early hominids lived mostly in the tropics, where solar radiation is very intense. They were otherwise unprotected from the sun. They didn't have sunscreen. They spent most of their time outdoors, and they did not wear clothing. And ultraviolet radiation causes cancer, which decreases survival. So given these conditions, ultraviolet radiation could have been a strong agent for selection in these hominids because of the need for optimum levels of melanin production in our early human ancestors. These selection pressures probably changed, though, as hominids moved out of Africa. In particular, the populations that occupied northern latitudes encountered cold temperatures and cloudy skies. Winter meant fewer hours of sunlight and solar radiation that was less direct. Moreover, since physiological adaptations were not sufficient to meet the demands of living in colder climates, these populations had undoubtedly adopted cultural practices such as using fire and wearing animal skins. As a response to the reduced exposure to sunlight in these northern climates, the advantages provided by deeply pigmented skin in the tropics were no longer important, and selection for melanin production may have been reduced. Relaxed selection for dark skin, though, does not explain why northerners lost their pigmentation. Okay? More than likely, if UV radiation was the only selective pressure at work, everyone should have stayed dark. More than likely, another factor, the need for adequate amounts of vitamin D, was also critical. The vitamin D hypothesis offers the following explanation. Vitamin D is a mineral that plays a vital role in the mineralization and normal growth of bone during both infancy and childhood. The body's primary source of vitamin D is to synthesize it through the interaction of ultraviolet light and a cholesterol substance that's found in our skin cells. So if normal bone growth is to occur, adequate sunlight is essential. So that's why parents from my generation were always sending their kids outside to play, because you need to go outside and be in the sun in order to have healthy bones. Normal bone growth requires exposure to sunlight. Insufficient vitamin D results in a medical condition called rickets. This causes bone deformities, especially of your weight-bearing bones, and these pelvic deformities cause many women to die in childbirth. You can get vitamin D from certain foods. It's available in fish, eggs, yolk, liver, and butter. But the body's primary source is to produce it itself. So, as I was noting, consequences of insufficient vitamin D are rickets, and it's a significant selective factor for less pigmented skin in regions where climate and other factors operate to reduce exposure to ultraviolet radiation. And that would occur in these northern temperate environments that are very cloudy, where you're not going to have a lot of ultraviolet radiation. Reduced exposure of sunlight would be detrimental to dark-skinned individuals because high concentration of melanin will filter out the ultraviolet radiation that was available, and people won't be producing sufficient amounts of vitamin D. So, is there any evidence for this vitamin D hypothesis? Actually, there's quite a bit. In the 19th century, blacks in northern U.S. cities suffered a higher rate of rickets than do whites in northern U.S. cities. Northern blacks were also more commonly affected than blacks living in the South because there's more sunlight in the South. The evidence for ultraviolet radiation as a selective factor is multiple. Skin cancer usually occurs later in life, after reproductive years, but this is because we've all adapted to ultraviolet radiation. In an African study, all albino individuals in Nigeria and Tanzania had either precancerous lesions or skin cancer before age 20. Thus, their reproductive potential is affected by their unpigmented skin. Nina Jablonski has an alternative hypothesis. She suggested that folate degradation, not skin cancer, may have been the selective pressure for dark skin. Folate is a B vitamin that must be replenished from the diet. Ultraviolet radiation rapidly depletes folate levels. Folate deficiencies in pregnant women lead to neural tube development problems and maternal death in pregnancy. Early hominids may have been light-skinned with dark hair, much like chimpanzees are today. As loss of their body hair occurred, dark skin evolved to protect folate supplies. But as the hominids moved out of Africa and moved into temperate climates, the selective pressures changed, as with the skin cancer theory. I would point out that more social importance has been attached to skin color than to any other single human biological trait. But aside from its adaptive significance, skin color is no more important physiologically than any other biological characteristic. Because this is so important, I want to repeat it. Skin color is no more important physiologically than any other biological characteristic. Skin color is exactly as important and unimportant as any other adaptive trait. Skin color, though, provides an excellent example of geographically patterned variation as the product of two conflicting selective forces. The selective forces are protection from ultraviolet radiation, and two, the need for ultraviolet radiation in order to have vitamin D synthesis. As an example, historically, people wondered why, in the early 1930s and 40s, people were wondering why African American school children were not drinking milk very often. And educators assumed that it was the lack of money or education. They didn't know that milk was good for you. That was the primary reason that black children were not drinking milk. And this led to school milk programs around the country. The actual reason, though, is after infancy, many people lack the enzyme lactase, which breaks down milk sugar, breaks down lactose, into simple sugars that your body can absorb. Lactose intolerance symptoms include things like bloating, cramps, gas, diarrhea. It's pretty uncomfortable, or so I'm told. The Baltimore study of 200 17 black children, though, showed that 85% of black children were lactose intolerant. 17% of white children were. So what you can see is that the main reason that these black children were not consuming milk at school had nothing to do with education levels. It had nothing to do with financial resources. It had to do with the fact that they knew and their parents knew that it made them sick, and thus they didn't choose to drink it. Now, evidence suggests that early hominids evolved in warm to hot savannas of East Africa, and humans cope better with heat than with cold, which is testament to the long-term adaptation to heat that evolved in our ancestors.